Thank you. Well, first of all, the subject that I have assigned to me, I have to introduce a little bit of introduction as to what the nature of the subject is on which I am to speak. Now, people talking about the U.S. economy in respect to Europe. Very few people in Europe know what a U.S. economy is. They have what they read from certain press and certain other information from institutions inside Europe, but they don't know the history of the United States. Actually, the history of the United States goes way back to Plato, and it's true. There's no exaggeration. The actual beginning of the United States, the train of, shall we say, breeding, the birthmarks and so forth, come with a great man from an earlier century, Nicholas of Cusa, who in the period prior to his demise recognized that the whole project of the Council of Florence and its results had been threatened by a movement which was centered as a reference point of power in Venice at that time, and the reconstruction of the Venetian operations, including the organizations of wars, had weakened and undermined the great achievement of the Council of Florence. Now, before he had died, Cusa said, we must send people across the oceans, the great oceans, to find a place where we can take these precious ideas of ours and plant them on a foreign soil, on a different continent, and bring forth on those other continents where this occurs, bring forth something which will be able to rescue Europe from its polluted system. And that was the actual birth. In point of fact, Christopher Columbus, on one trip to the capital of Portugal, he was a famous sea captain in the Portuguese service at the time, with Spanish credentials as well, not to the Habsburgs, but to the opposition to the Habsburgs, which had been the previous ruling house of Spain. And Cusa was given the report on this subject to a friend of Cusa's, who was a high-ranking official in Portugal at the time. And on the basis of this, Cusa proposed this policy, that we send people across the great oceans to establish cooperation with whoever we find there, and to bring them together as the basis for a society which was free of this venereal disease called Europe, the European system, which was Venetian-controlled, and is in principle still Venetian-controlled today. But also this had an older origin. The older origin goes back to take us back to Greece and to Macedon. During the period of Philip of Macedon, there was an agreement between Philip and the Achaemenid dynasty. And that was to establish a code between Asia and Europe, as represented by these parties, which would become the oligarchical system. In other words, the characteristic features of the Persian Empire, whose characteristics are traced from Babylon and similar kinds of bad places, and the situation in general was such that we needed to make this kind of fundamental change. We had to recognize that the problem of Europe is that it continues to be a victim, especially since that agreement between Philip and the Persian Empire on the oligarchical system. And what this means is, and this is the key to the whole problem, to understand the United States and to understand Europe and their relationship in particular. We are living in Europe under the oligarchical system. And that's the source of our economic problem. We also are in the United States, because the United States never was, except for a very brief period, a leading power in the world. The actual leading power was various forms of the Roman Empire and its, this Byzantine Empire that followed, which was a revival of the Roman Empire, the Crusader system, which was the so-called Venetian system, the old Venetian system, which is part of the same thing. And then, of course, we have today in the British Empire, which was established actually as the new Venetian party system of William of Orange, who came in to pollute Europe, especially England, and England has never recovered from William of Orange, who created the foundation for what became in 1763 the British Empire with the Peace of Paris, because the damn fools of European nations began to make war upon each other, and the British sat there organized and excited the warfare, and when the victims had all bled themselves mutually to death, the British declared themselves an empire in 1763. So this is a problem. Now, the United States actually originated as a formation, despite the intention of Columbus and what was done in that terms. The Habsburgs takeover of the Spanish family, royal family, through invasion of the marriage bed of the former house, took over Spain. And so at the very time that Columbus was landing in North America, the power over Spain had been taken over by the Habsburg dynasty. And that's how the whole thing began. So from that point on, even the early colonizations in the Americas, under the Spanish and to some degree the Portuguese, which is pretty much the same thing then, this colonization was polluted from the beginning by the fact of the Habsburg influence. So therefore, you have a new development, which came from the opposition forces in England, who actually were reviving the policies of Cusa. The English development was generally crushed, but among those in the Netherlands and in England who agreed with the importance of a change, a new colonization was uttered into the Massachusetts Bay area, the Pilgrims first and then the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And there was established a form of republic with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts then. And as long as it survived, was intact until William of Orange, this institution created a turn back to an economic principle on a credit system, not a monetary system. Because the key thing here is that the European systems are monetary systems, and money has no intrinsic relationship to physical economic value. If in the United States, in the founding of the United States, we went back to the policies of the East India, or not the East India, but rather the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We went back to those policies. Benjamin Franklin, was an heir of that, the same policies. And the United States was generated on the continuation of those policies. There was one advantage in this exceptional. The British were so bad in their behavior, their imperialistic behavior as the British Empire, that you had an alliance in Europe of France, in particular, the King of Spain, and led by the great Tsarina of Russia, you had the League of Armed Neutrality. So these forces allied themselves, realizing what fools they'd made of themselves and letting the British suck them into these crazy wars against each other. And for one moment, they supported the young North American Republic in defeat of the British forces. This was essentially completed in 1782. But it still didn't work, because the separate colonies were under influences of British influences largely. And therefore, they were trying to operate under a monetary system of the British model, or the Anglo-Dutch monetary system. So what happens, we should point, now Franklin already had a conception of what this policy of the young American Republic must be. But it had to be reclarified. So Franklin took a young protege of his, Alexander Hamilton, and they said, what are we going to do? Here we have this war debt which we've incurred among the various colonies in fighting against British imperialism. But now we're stuck with our nominal victory, our nominal independence, but we owe debts all over the place to Europe for the costs of the war. And Franklin and Company's influence, and Alexander Hamilton said there's only one solution. We have to pay this debt, which is the war debt. How do we get rid of it? Well, he said, we're going to create a credit system. And so the U.S. Constitution was a reform of what became the United States, but it was a reform, a fundamental systemic reform into the form of a credit system. Now, what this means that as long as a nation functions on a true credit system, in which there is no gambling is allowed. Everything has to be as the Massachusetts Bay Colony did under its own original constitution. Credit was uttered as a debt. The relations of debt were calculated on the estimation of performance, and the debts were paid. That was the principle. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was the most successful experiment in economics in that entire period. It was crushed by William of Orange, who was in the process of raping the Irish and killing the Irish and doing nice things like that. So our roots were in this. We adopted a federal constitution which changed the character of the United States as a nation. It was a transitional period in which we came up with a constitutional form of self-government, as expressed succinctly in the preamble of that Constitution. It's when you read the preamble from the standpoint of this background that you really understand what this is. Since that time, we in the United States, usually beleaguered by allied forces in Europe, we, from time to time, were able to carry the idea of the credit system into a success. The success was secured, in part, by the development of the canal and railway systems, and the development of railway systems out of canal systems, and the development then of the transcontinental railway system. We won the Civil War, and the victory of the Civil War unlaunched us as a world power. The great influx of migration into the United States in the period of that war helped build the United States on these conceptions. But then Lincoln was assassinated and things didn't go so well. Grant tried, but he was not as smart in these matters as President Lincoln had been. We went on. We were still a great power. We had great presidents when they weren't being assassinated on British interests. But then McKinley assassination changed everything. And we had a skunk who got in as president, Teddy Roosevelt, who was owned by the British. And we foolishly got ourselves into a world war. A world war which is organized by the British by getting Bismarck out, and the elimination of Bismarck, who understood the game of the so-called 7 Years' War game, said no. And Bismarck had made an agreement with the Tsar of Russia not to be trapped into a world war in Europe by the folly of an old Habsburg bum who still was called a Kaiser. He was not going to be involved in using a Balkan war to draw the rest of Europe into a world war. So the British did the simple thing. They got Bismarck fired in 1890. Then they made a deal with Japan to attack China, to destroy Korea, and then to destroy Russia, to accelerate the Balkan Wars. Europe was depleted. The United States was under President Teddy Roosevelt one time, in that period, who was a bum, a traitor, a scum. We had another president, Woodrow Wilson, who was the refounder of the Ku Klux Klan, a fine gentleman. And he organized the Ku Klux Klan from inside the premises of the White House. That's how it was done. Fine fellow. During the 1920s, we had a president who was functional. He died of oysters on a train. Died of oysters on a train? No. So anyway, we had that problem too. The Harding was gone. And the New England crowd, the same old Tory bunch, were back in business again. Then came Franklin Roosevelt. And Frank Roosevelt was a descendant of a great Roosevelt, Isaac Roosevelt, a collaborator of Alexander Hamilton. And that was reflected. And so Roosevelt immediately took a step. He was prepared for his governorship in New York State. And the step was Glass-Steagall, the Glass-Steagall Law of 1933. What the Glass-Steagall Law was not a precedent in legislation. It was an attempt to get back to the intent of the original Constitution. And it's still that today. All the European systems have never freed themselves from an oligarchical system in which money is controlled by an imperial power. And imperialism since Rome, since ancient Roman imperialism, was always based on the supremacy of a currency controlled entirely by a tyranny from the top. So everything was rigged. Prices are rigged. Everything was rigged by the central agency of government, which was an imperial power. And then you would have wars among the imperial powers, wars sometimes to eliminate a certain part of the thing, friendly gestures, kill your neighbors policy, and for other reasons. And this is what got us into this kind of mess, to take us into wars. Now we've reached the point now, as many of you may have observed, that general warfare can no longer be accomplished among major powers on this planet, because the existence of nuclear and thermonuclear weapons and similar systems, it is not possible for the great powers of the world to engage in a serious war. So what we do instead, the imperial powers now pick on certain nations, as we saw in the 2 Iraq wars, the wars that are going on now in Afghanistan and so forth. We use wars on the fringes, we use destabilizations on the fringes to have the same effect as warfare, to control society by organizing war as the British did in the case of the 7 Years' War. Get the suckers, like Friedrich de Grosse recognized this, that he'd been a fool, a successful fool. He was the most effective military commander on the continent of Europe. He didn't have enough troops to win all the battles he had, but he was the greatest military genius of that particular time. Then he's like, oy vey, what did I do? He realized that he'd made a mistake. He'd won the wars effectively, marginally, but he'd lost the cause. And this is a typical thing of war today. People fight wars and think they're going to win something. They've lost the cause. We've reached the point that you have to have agreements and disagreements among nations must be resolved out of the war field. If you get into general warfare, civilization will be destroyed. And that is the great danger today, that those who are playing the game with the Euro game, coming from Britain, will just find the way to ruin the world, starting with Europe, by stirring up conflict, social conflict, quasi-military conflict in the Mediterranean region. So we must avoid war because it's now a poison. No longer is warfare effective as a means of defense. General warfare among nations means nuclear weapons and beyond. And when you talk about nuclear war, you cannot control it. Once you start talking about biological warfare, is also an aspect of you can't control it. Therefore, warfare among principal nations cannot be tolerated. But you cannot make arbitrary peace. What you have to do is find a common interest among respectively sovereign entities as nations. And the fight to define the terms of a progressive common interest, which is largely always associated with a physical economic end to it, is the way to resolve problems. Is to realize that if you can't kill, then what are you going to do if you have a quarrel? You've got to create a system which is both effective economically for the parties involved, even despite the fact they don't like it, but that it will work and solve the problem. We've reached the state which I think we can do that. But that's what you have to understand. That's what the issue is here. We're talking about Glass-Steagall. That's the form of the solution. It's a form of the solution which is implicit in the work of Nicholas Akusa. It's the form of solution which was demonstrated in Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's the form was demonstrated in the formation of the Constitution of the United States. It was the form demonstrated by the Lincoln administration, intended by the Winthrop administration, accomplished by the Roosevelt administration. We've always understood in the United States, those of us who are veterans, old enough to be in World War II, and there we knew what we were doing. At least we in the United States largely did know what we're doing. But since that time, we've gone the wrong way. And we've made as big mistakes as anybody else. And once we learn that lesson and learn that we have to deal with the real problem, we recognize what the enemy is. The enemy is the financier oligarchy. And the financier oligarchy, centered in the British Empire, and it's still a British Empire, which controls Europe and much of the United States today. So we sit like fools, like nations killing each other in the 7 Years' War in Europe. We find an enemy to kill, an enemy to hate. We focus our attention on trying to get a victory against that selected enemy, to make them a victim. We do not proceed consciously with efficient attention on the interest of which we fight and build is the welfare of humanity as a whole. The notion that nations must be sovereign, because without the cultural factor of sovereignty, human creativity cannot proceed. Human creativity depends upon the ability of the human mind to freely innovate in making contributions which can be accepted and demonstrated as useful to humanity as a whole. We need to have national sovereignty because we need to have the participation of a people in its own culture. Otherwise, their creative powers are not manifest. So we in the United States today, because we have a privileged position, potentially, if we get rid of this present president, who is not really a president, he's a disease. He's a mental case, who should, under the 25th Amendment of Section 4, provides for the elimination of mental cases from the presidency. We have now a very diseased quality of mental case called President Obama. He's a pathological case. He's as pathological as Adolf Hitler was in the extreme. And he's going in the same direction. The danger is that he, out of his stress, will try, under British promotion, to organize new kinds of wars and strife as a way of trying to controlling society, according to the same principle that the British monarchy used in the 7 Years' War. Stir up quarrels among your intended victims. Let them cut each other's throat. And you come out of the thing collecting all the tribute. That's the way the game is being played. If we simply in the United States, therefore, knowing the weakness in Europe, that Europeans do not understand what a credit system is. They don't understand the difference between a monetarist system and a credit system. Therefore, if we in the United States do our job, the job which is peculiarly suited to our nature and history, then, if we enact Glass-Steagall and throw this bum of a president into the mental institution where he belongs, then we will have established the only option for Europe under which Europe can survive. If we set the precedent, then Europe has no choice among the so-called monetarist powers. It has no choice. It has to accept the fact that the American dollar, under this kind of reform, is a factor that cannot be ignored. They cannot overlook the fact that China is looking very closely at the United States, wondering if the United States is going to come back to itself, in which case China can breathe deeply a sigh of relief, and other nations as well. It's up to the United States to do its duty for all humanity, a duty which it historically incurred in the founding of the United States itself, founded in the form initially of the Massachusetts Bay Colony until that charter was taken away by William of Orange, the representative on Europe, the European continent, of the new Venetian party, the same school of usury of the old Venice, the same school of usury agreed upon between what? Between Prince Philip of Macedon and the Persian emperor. It's called the Agreement Establishing European Imperial Tyranny in a form based on the oligarchical principle. The oligarchy must control everything and maintain power over the sheep by getting the sheep to kill each other out of folly. We have to grow up as Europeans across both sides of the Atlantic. We have to grow up and recognize our duty to each other. The United States must recognize its historic duty to Europe in this matter, and vice versa. Together, with that approach, even at this dark hour that we've come into now, we can survive. European civilization can resume going forward. It's there. What is needed is the understanding, the will, and the forms of cooperation which will enable us to use this as a means to solve the problem. The problem is intrinsically soluble. Do we have the brains and courage to do it? That's the only question. And this is what we're doing with this thing about Glass-Steagall in the United States. And this involves other complications. Just one other is notable here. The problem I have with the United States government is our party system. Now, under the principle of liberalism, is that under liberalism there's no truth. That's the doctrine of British liberalism. There is no truth. Read Adam Smith and his prescription of this. There's no truth in society. Mankind is not capable of knowing the actual truth. He can only know what is for him pleasure or pain. The British system is called British liberalism. There are no boundaries, there are no principal boundaries, there are no loyalties, there's no truth. There's only pleasure and pain. Therefore, if a government wishes to become a tyranny, it has to dish out pleasure, as it defines it, and pain for those who don't like the pleasure. And that's the way it works. So that what happens is then party interest, and this happens in Europe too, party interest becomes more important to those who are attached to that party than is the nation. Therefore, when push comes to shove, the question is, well, if it's good for the nation, maybe we'll support it. But is it good for our party? And you find in Europe the same thing. We have it in the United States. The Democratic and Republican Party, and then the sub-parties. People say, well, we've got to stick together. Yes, we like to deal with these guys, but we have to have it our way too, you know what I mean? Therefore, we got to keep the party members together and drive party members out who don't agree with that policy. That's what you get this display of cowardice on the part of, of a senator from Massachusetts. A coward lied on the issue of the war in Libya supporting the argument that the war in Libya is not a war. It's a public service organization. It's a bloody war, and it's being spread unnecessarily. And we can't get anybody in Europe to recognize this. Not least those in power, only government. There's no reason for that war. We can handle the problem in other ways. We nations, if we agree that we've got a disease among us, among the nations, nations can properly agree to take those measures which preferably are free of any taint of homicide, to make sure that an errant force in some nation is told they have a lousy future if they don't behave themselves. We have the capability of doing that. We can orchestrate the environment if we understand what we're doing. We don't have to kill. But now you have a doctrine. Well, killing is all right if you like it, if you like doing it. And that's what the other side of the thing is. The problem we have, you've got to override party partisanship as a factor in national decisions. National decisions must be made by the people, by the institutions, not by party. The parties are useful only if they serve the purpose of the nation. Parties are useful as they open up the dialogue and force the dialogue on which the common interest in the nation exists and the common interests among nations exist. To find what is the pathway of common interest, not for opinion, but for mankind. And the test is, what are we doing for the human species? Are we making it better fed, better educated? Are we equipping ourselves to deal with the increasing dangers that this shift in man's position, the solar system's position in respect to the galaxy? Are we acting on that? We need a high technology science driver program. We need even before and beyond thermonuclear fusion. Because without a great increase in the power of humanity per capita and per square kilometer, we cannot assure coming generations that the human species will continue to exist. We're coming into a dangerous period. And we are reminded by history and by science that the only species which has been capable of surviving the mass kills of all species, about 95% of all species that have ever existed, have been destroyed because they became outdated in terms of the circumstances in the universe around them. Therefore, our mission is to increase the power of mankind, not over one another, but over those forces in the galaxy and beyond, which are now threatening. Remember, humanity has existed on this planet only for several million years. Of all the existence. Towards this period, 95% of all species that ever existed have been exterminated, like the dinosaurs, for example. And under certain conditions that mankind as a species has never experienced, but which we're coming to as a repetition of a 62 million year cycle in the galaxy now. We cannot sit back and knit wool and protect humanity from extinction. We have been given a weapon, the conscious mind, the conscious creative mind of the human individual. We can increase our power to protect mankind and to develop the secure conditions for mankind. We can do that. We have the access. We have developments in science which are pointing in the direction by developing those capabilities. We can save mankind. We will still maintain nation states as sovereign if we're wise, because it's within the culture, the national cultures of people, that the power to create is located. We can do all these nice things. We just have to rise above the petty considerations which lure people into folly. It's all right to have a donkey, but don't marry one. Thank you.